In January this year, I wrote an article titled "Finding a Good Coach is Hard. Don't Make It Harder. Why Bath Should Learn from Harlequins and Move On from Stuart Hooper." And as we're approaching the Premiership final, Harlequins are going to be there under Billy Millard and co. and have a very good chance of winning a trophy. Bath languid towards the bottom of the table and managed to finish 7th, but only because of getting 2 wins from COVID forfeits, and they would have been 9th on a points per game basis. So since this crossroads, these two teams have been on incredibly different trajectories. And it seems that Harlequins have massively benefited by pulling the trigger. And the crux of this article is kind of something we'd learned from NFL quarterbacks, where they're such a difference maker. And I do think coaches and directors of rugby in the Premiership and rugby worldwide can be such a difference maker that you do need to find a good one. Especially when we have an even playing field with the salary cap, an edge in schemes and systems could be the difference between you being in the Premiership final or being 9th. The crux of the article was that Bath should move on from Stuart Hooper because there were no signs that he was an elite coach or elite director of rugby. But there were 2 criticisms of the article which I do think were fair. One was that I used the term director of rugby and coach interchangeably, as I already have, which, yes, admittedly, probably is a fair criticism, but without necessarily knowing the organisational structures of these things, we don't really know, and you want to criticise the person who's in charge of tactics and strategy, as these things all have different names in different sports, and rugby seems to have different hierarchies and structures from team to team. In the NFL, it's very clear. We have a head coach who's in charge of all those schemes and running the plays and things like that. And you have a general manager who's in charge of the logistical side of it, who's in charge of player recruitment and things. And both those roles sort of fall under director of rugby or potentially head coach in rugby. And you look at football, and director of football is in charge of the logistics and things, whilst the manager is in charge of doing the tactics and the strategy for things. So we don't really have, I think, set verbiage for these things in rugby. So I will use those interchangeably, and I apologise for that. But maybe I'll start a petition to change the official title to whoever's in charge is head honcho or top dog. So from now on, maybe I'll refer to them as top dog. How to find a top dog, this video should be called. Another criticism of the article was that I said that Bath should move on from Stuart Hooper, but I didn't suggest potential candidates of who Bath should hire instead. And again, the point of the article was it almost didn't matter. It was about taking another roll of the dice. And so it didn't really matter who you hired. I mean, it matters to a certain extent. Don't hire someone just off the street or hire someone like me. Although, if you are watching Premiership rugby teams, you should hire me. And that's a totally not biased perspective. But you do want to hire someone smart with a good rugby brain, but it almost doesn't matter too much because you don't know what you're necessarily going to get from a coach. So you're rolling the dice. And the thing is, you're rolling the dice trying to get a 6. The best way you can do that is by rolling the dice as many times as you can. If you roll the dice once, you've only got a 1 in 6 chance of rolling a 6. If you roll the dice twice, well, you've got an 11 in 36 chance of rolling a 6. Almost a third. So that's why you shouldn't stick with a coach too long if you don't think they're going to be an elite coach who elevates your team. Like a Pat Lam, like a Rob Baxter, who are both absolutely fantastic coaches. But now we have to look at, okay, well, who are we going to hire? How do we hire a head coach or a director of rugby or a top dog? These things are obviously quite difficult. How do you evaluate a coach? How do you evaluate a director of rugby? They're so difficult because you can't separate them from their talent levels necessarily. And are players playing well because they're good, or are players playing well because they've been coached to play well? We don't know. So that's something we have to think about. But broadly, there's been work done with the Premier League in football, and that wage bill does correlate pretty well to performance. That is a relatively efficient market, and players who are better tend to get paid more. And so you can kind of gain from that, well, who is overperforming where they should be based on their wages they spend, and who is underperforming based on the wages they spend. And when we have a salary cap, theoretically everyone should be spending the same sort of amount. So you would say those at the top those at the top who have been there consistently have done a pretty good job. There's also, maybe some statistical measurements we can use. I like looking at points difference. Wins and losses over a big enough sample probably will give you an indicator, but we don't, even one season doesn't really give us a big sample of wins and losses. It's 22 games. It's been a bit less than that because of a few COVID cancellations this year in the Premiership. But, that can be noisy. You might win some games you shouldn't. You might lose some games you shouldn't. So I like looking at points difference more than wins and losses, because if you think about it, it kind of gives you a bigger sample size of things that can happen. If you win a game by 70 points, that should be valued more than if you win a game by a single point. And there's a few other things I like looking at. So one thing I think is quite good indicator of a team's underlying performance, that does correlate to sort of points scored or points conceded and wins and losses somewhat, is meters and clean breaks made. So looking at meters per carry and clean breaks per carry, both in attack and defence, I think can be a pretty good indicator of what a team is doing well and what a team isn't doing well. And of course, that's not the only thing that an attack is built around. It's not the only thing that a defence is built around. It's only part of the puzzle. So maybe with more advanced metrics, we could be looking at first phase efficiency, not just red zone efficiency, but you think about what exited do, but that sort of efficiency from within 5 meters. Are they good at that? And that's the thing with, if you look at just clean breaks and meters per carry, Exeter, despite being one of the highest scorers in the league, actually are very inefficient there. But that's because their attack isn't necessarily built through clean breaks and making meters. It's about getting into those optimum red zone positions and then just battering over. So there's those things we have to take into account. And also there's a few qualitative things you want to look at. Obviously clean breaks are good and, making them are good, but have they just happened because you have better players who are managing to step 5 guys and wiggle through, or have you done something schematic there that has created the space? So I think Bath have actually done pretty well in attack this season, despite lots of criticism of how they've been shaped in attack, partly because they just have players that can run through people and beat guys, so their attack has been kind of broadly fine. Now, I think there's 4 types of people who you can hire as your director of rugby, your head coach, your top dog, as it were. And the first one is what Harlequins did with Billy Millard and what Wasps did with Lee Blackett, both of whom made Premiership finals. But obviously you get these mid-season turmoil where your coach leaves or was forced to leave. So, you have to find someone pretty quickly. So hiring someone internally, hiring an internal assistant, kind of is the de facto thing, but it can work. And, I think it's worked in both those cases, because what you know is, if you're internal, is you can see those problems firsthand. You might know this is a glaring issue that you need to fix and tweak it. With Harlequins, the easy thing was probably just like, we have to unleash Marcus Smith. And they're playing at such high tempo since that Millard and things have taken over that maybe there's not anything that complicated happening. Although I do think they do a couple of good things well. But, the whole thing was built around speed and tempo, and that change just completely unlocked the team. And interestingly enough, this is the thing with CEOs, where those hired internally tend to do better than those hired externally, which isn't necessarily what you'd expect. But, seeing those problems firsthand that you can tweak may be more beneficial. I'm not sure. But, this probably doesn't tend to happen all that often. It tends to be sort of an extreme set of circumstances, but it is a good way of just like, look, we have to move on from our coach. There's this guy who's the backs or forwards coach that seems to be doing well. Let's just roll the dice and see if it works. And if it doesn't, hey, we'll roll it again. Now, the flip side of obviously the internal assistant is the external assistant, which I would probably describe as kind of the NFL method of how you do it. Obviously, the way the hierarchies work in the NFL is you have a head coach and then you have an offensive coordinator and a defensive coordinator. So it tends to be what teams do is, if you're looking for a head coach, you hire a successful team's offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator, depending on kind of what you want and who's available, all sorts of those things. And I guess what's kind of good about that is, you can get someone from a good team, who's under a good head coach or a good director of rugby and hopefully absorbing that knowledge. So, you'd love someone from Bristol or Exeter absorbing what Pat Lam and Rob Baxter have to say and trying to learn those lessons and things. And also say if they are an attacking coach or they are a defensive coach, we can maybe look at those underlying numbers and be like, okay, they're clearly doing this very well, or okay, they're clearly doing this very well. So, for instance, an attacking assistant coach we might be looking at is someone like Sam Vesti of Northampton, and they've ranked third in clean breaks per carry and metres per carry this season, behind Harlequins and Bristol, which is pretty good. And it does look like they are doing things. It isn't just having superior firepower and talent. They are trying to make holes and make spaces. And I think, even seeing something that's like Dan Bigger's performance, I think is probably taken a step up with a Sam Vesti there. He's putting more guys into holes and things like that. And those sorts of things do matter. And if we look at the defensive side, although he is a head coach, he's someone I'm incredibly interested in. And I think every single team should be trying to hire him as a director of rugby, if they can, is Ali Heffer, Exeter, whose defensive stats are incredible. And I don't know how much control he has over defence. Maybe he is more on the attacking side of the ball. But you want someone from Exeter there who's not only, there with their incredible defence that's the best in the league on those metrics, and they've conceded the fewest amount of tries and the fewest amount of points. Something is going very, very right there. But also, someone who's absorbed Rob Baxter's game of like kicking to the corner and being hyper efficient from that close range, which I'm a massive fan of. But then if you can get someone like that, but then also you add in a very, very good attacking game that does make clean breaks and does make meters, well then, hey, you've got one hell of a rugby team there. Obviously, hiring an assistant of a very good head coach isn't necessarily guaranteed success. So I kind of called this the NFL model, and two of the best coaches, if not the two best coaches in the NFL, are Andy Reid and Bill Belichick. And both of those have obviously had assistants that have been hired. But Andy Reid's assistants have done pretty well. John Harbaugh and Doug Peterson have both won Super Bowls, and Matt Nagy, who's still head coach for the Chicago Bears, I think has done an all right job, even if it hasn't gone incredibly well there. But part of that has been the quarterback situation. But Bill Belichick, who's won 6 Super Bowls with the New England Patriots, incredible, maybe the greatest coach of all time. Some of his assistants have just really done terribly elsewhere because they haven't seemed to have really got the things that Bill Belichick does well ingrained into them. So Josh McDaniels and Matt Patricia have both kind of failed when they've had head coaching jobs, but then gone back to New England and done pretty well. The third type is probably the one that I think most casual fans would sort of want, and that would be the proven commodity. Bath have been linked to Steve Diamond and Scotty Robertson, of all people. And I would love Bath to hire Scotty Robertson. As a Bath fan, I can't see it happening personally, but it's, the kind of coach that people want because it's a known name who they can hire. A good example of one that's out there and that doesn't seem to be being talked about much at the moment, I think, is Michael Checker, who's currently coaching Rugby League for Lebanon, I believe. And, maybe Michael Checker's career with Australia didn't end in the greatest of ways. They got beaten by England pretty comprehensively in that World Cup final and lost to Wales in the group stages, I think. They weren't as good as they were in sort of when they made the World Cup final in 2015. But hey, Michael Checker made a World Cup final with Australia. And maybe just the talent in Australia hasn't been as good as the expectations have been. If we've learned anything from Super Rugby Trans-Tasman, is that there is a gulf in talent between New Zealand and Australia at the moment. And maybe Michael Checker did do pretty damn well with that Australia team, especially around 2014, 2015 when he first came in. But it's not just that, he's won a Super Rugby title with the Waratahs and won a Heineken Cup with Leinster. That is an incredible CV. And even though some of that was, I think the Waratahs was 2014, the Heineken Cup win was 2009, it's a while ago, and because we're only really seeing the fruits of professionalism now, rugby is still a fast evolving game, and even the game 10 years ago probably isn't the same as the game today. It's still such a good CV that it's got to be better than coaching Lebanon Rugby League, surely. And maybe it's a passion project for him, and he loves doing it. I think he might have Lebanese ancestry and things. But, if you're really desperate for a head coach and you have a bit of money, why not hire Michael Checker? Because there's a chance that he is brilliant. And the fourth type of person you can hire, which I don't think really happens a lot in rugby, is hiring a head coach or director of rugby from the level below. I don't think we've ever really seen a Premiership side hire a successful coach from the Championship. Maybe it's something that's happened in France, I'm not too sure. And maybe it's happened elsewhere, maybe a Welsh team has hired someone from the Welsh Premiership, but it doesn't seem a common route into becoming a head coach of a top-tier professional team. And maybe it should, in the Premier League. One of, I think, the best young English managers at the moment is Graham Potter, who was hired by Brighton from Swansea, and he was hired from Swansea from Östersunds, the Swedish team. So he's really worked his way up, and he's proven himself at lower levels, and then he's moved up, and he's doing pretty well despite results. The underlying numbers have been very, very good. But rugby doesn't really do that. We tend to, be in our kind of Premiership top tier bubbles. So I've tried to kind of identify a couple of guys, and interestingly enough, they're both coaching pairs from a level below that I think would be interesting. One is, who I would think would be incredibly exciting to see in the Premiership, is the coaching pair of Cornish Pirates of Alan Paver and Gavin Cattle. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't actually seen a lot of Cornish Pirates, if any, over the last couple of seasons. Sometimes watching the Championship isn't always the easiest thing in the world. But obviously, if you were hiring a guy, you would love to do your due diligence, watch them, try and get the qualitative factors, maybe do some, find some data to actually back it up, see if it is good, see if it is the sort of thing you want, and also, the philosophical style of play, those kinds of things. But they've done, I think, a pretty good job there. I think they came fourth this season, got a win over Saracens first game of the season, and although they only had 6 wins and 4 losses, which doesn't scream off the page as incredible, it was with a 5.8 points difference per game, which is pretty good. That's probably sort of looking at top 4 if it was in the Premiership, maybe just slightly outside the top 4. But with their resources there, and without fully knowing, maybe they do have better resources than other teams, but it does seem since they came in, they have steadily improved. And last season, I think they came third with a very, very good record and had a points difference per game of 9.5, which, is incredible and would be looking at, towards the top of the Premiership. And obviously, you want to do more research and see, hey, are these guys that can actually translate to the Premiership? But I don't see why not. And I don't see why that's more of a risk than hiring an ex-player who just happened to play for your team, rather than someone who's actually proven themselves at lower level. And that's the thing is, we maybe should be using the Championship as a breeding ground. Stuart Hooper came in with no experience, no knowledge, and is under immense pressure from the get-go. As guys in the Championship, the expectations aren't necessarily as high. They are going to be given more time to settle and things, and, they can learn their craft. The other pair I've been intrigued by is the pair of the Tasman Mako guys from the Mitre 10, which for some reason has 14 teams, but from the Mitre 10, who I think they've won the Championship 2 years back-to-back and have done it with very healthy points difference as well. But also they've done it without necessarily the resources of some of the top regions in the Mitre 10. I mean, Auckland have been their main competitor, whose resources absolutely dwarf them. I actually managed to find a document from Deloitte, showcasing revenues and profits of Mitre 10 teams. As you can see, their revenue isn't the smallest, but it's absolutely dwarfed by some others. And then they've actually been consistently making a profit as well, which probably means their expenditure isn't as high as some of these other teams. And if we, look at it from a population-based perspective, they're not the smallest population base, but again, compared to Auckland and some of the biggest regions, they are having a smaller player pool. And, inherently having a bigger player pool probably is going to lead to you producing better players. They've done really well, despite not necessarily having the same resources as others, which, as I said, is one of the key indicators you want to look for. Can they overperform what they're doing with the resources they've been given? I think the pair have now been split up, and I think there's a genuinely good chance that Clark Dermody ends up the Highlanders head coach for the next Super Rugby season by the sound of it, and has been an assistant there. And Andrew Goodman, I think, has been helping out the Crusaders as well. So maybe they are kind of the best of both worlds, of a bit of external assistant, especially Andrew Goodman, learning under one of the best coaches in the game. And also, and coaching at a lower level. So I think there's a very good chance they both become Super Rugby head coaches at some point. But, why not get in early while the iron's hot? And a team like Bath maybe said, hey, rather than waiting around for 5 years, hoping for one of 5 jobs to open up in Super Rugby, which might never happen, do you want to come over here and do a job? And again, going back to the Stuart Hooper article, we have no idea if any of these coaches will succeed. They might all be rubbish, and there might be things outside your control, which means they don't succeed. I mean, Paul Gustard maybe was a good head coach, but because of a player revolt there was no way he was ever going to succeed, because he was essentially going to be forced out. The same with someone like Sam Vesti. We can be like, yeah, we know he can run an attacking game, but can he run the defensive side of the game? Does he know things about set pieces, and what's our plan when we get a prop yellow carded, who we take off, and all these other things that you don't necessarily have to think about when you're an assistant coach and then become the director of rugby or head coach. So there are unknowns, there are uncertainties, and hey, even if you are good, sometimes the bounce of a rugby ball just doesn't go in your favour. You can be good and unlucky, and I think that's a message I do want to hammer sometimes, is there's more luck in rugby than people realise. But again, it's all about rolling that dice. Don't be stuck with a coach that is average or below average. Do keep looking. Do try and find someone who is a top tier head coach, because they are hard to find. Rob Baxter, Exeter, just got lucky with him, and he has had years to hone his craft. Pat Lamb, Bristol, essentially had to buy him off Connor after he just won the Pro 14 or Pro 12 as it might have been then. They're really, really hard to find, and if you can roll the dice more and more, you are more likely to find that guy. And it would be nice if one of these guys does become a top tier head coach. We don't know. But yeah, it's difficult, and don't make it harder for yourself. Move on quickly, don't move on too late, and do proper research of who you're hiring. For the love of God, sports teams everywhere, stop hiring ex-players just because they know the insert team name way, they have insert team name DNA. Just don't do it. Hire someone who might actually be competent. Stop using nepotism. For God's sake. I'm heated about that. I hate that. I hate teams hiring ex-players. Doesn't work. Hire on a meritocracy, please. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. Goodbye.